The message came while I was standing beside my husband, pretending to laugh at a joke I didn't hear. My phone buzzed once, quietly, like it already knew I'd hide it. "If you need a moment, meet me upstairs." No explanation. No emoji. Just those words. I locked the screen before anyone noticed, but the sentence stayed glowing in my mind, louder than the entire room. I shouldn't have felt relief reading it. I shouldn't have felt anything. But I did. For months I'd been moving through my own home like a shadow of myself. My husband barely looked at me unless something needed to be done. My presence had become a convenience, my silence a default setting. Even tonight, surrounded by people, I felt like a placeholder. And he, Mark, was the only one who ever seemed to notice. Not in a dramatic, obvious way. Just in small moments, like when he'd ask if I'd eaten or when he'd read the expression I tried to hide. He was careful, almost too careful, as if he knew one wrong word could expose something neither of us should feel. That I replayed the message to check if I was imagining the sincerity behind it. He didn't owe me comfort. He didn't owe me anything. But he still reached out, quietly, discreetly, like someone who had been paying attention for far longer than I realized. And that attention alone was enough to make my heart tighten. I shouldn't go. I knew that. But I also knew I was tired of pretending I wasn't hurting, tired of being the only one holding my relationship together, tired of swallowing every emotion because expressing them only led to silence in return. I told my husband I needed fresh air. He nodded without looking at me, already laughing with someone else. That was all the permission I needed. I stepped out of the noisy room into the hallway, the air colder, clearer, as if the walls themselves were waiting for me to make a choice. The staircase stood at the end, quiet, unlit, almost symbolic in its stillness. My heartbeat wasn't nerves, it was clarity. It was the sudden realization that someone had seen me slipping long before I admitted it to myself. I walked slowly, not out of hesitation but because I needed to understand what I was walking toward. I wasn't going upstairs to betray anyone. Not physically. But something inside me already knew this moment would shift everything I'd been avoiding. The emotional distance at home, the arguments brushed under the rug, the loneliness that followed me even in crowded rooms. All of it had been pushing me somewhere. And his message simply opened the final door. With every step, guilt and relief twisted together. What if he only wanted to talk? What if he regretted sending that message? What if I was about to cross a line I could never uncross? The questions followed me, but my feet kept moving. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, took a breath, and realized the truth. I wasn't here because of him. I was here because of everything I had been unable to say for far too long. Then I walked forward. The hallway upstairs was dim and unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes every breath sound louder than it should. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I should knock, call his name, or turn around before I unraveled something I couldn't put back together. The door at the end of the hall was slightly open, light spilling out in a thin line across the floor. That was where he was. Or at least, where he said he'd be. I pushed the door slowly, expecting to see him alone, maybe leaning against the wall or waiting with that patient look he always gave me. But the sight that met me nearly stopped me where I stood. Mark was there, but he wasn't alone. Two more men sat with him, both familiar faces from the same circle, men who had been present at countless gatherings, men who observed more than they spoke. I froze, confusion tightening around me instantly. This wasn't what I came for. This wasn't what I'd been bracing myself to face. Mark stood up first, as if he had anticipated my reaction. "Before you say anything, just listen." His voice was calm, careful, like he knew the wrong tone could send me straight back down the stairs. The two others didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't exchange looks. They weren't there for entertainment. They weren't there for anything I feared in those first few seconds. Their expressions were serious, almost heavy. My first instinct was to leave. Whatever this was, whatever they thought they were doing, I wasn't prepared for it. "I shouldn't be here," I said, already stepping back. But one of the others, Daniel, shook his head gently. "You need to hear this. You've needed to for a long time." His voice wasn't accusing. It was sympathetic in a way that made something inside me feel exposed. That I didn't sit. I didn't trust the floor beneath me, let alone the emotions rising in my chest. "Why are you all here?" I asked. It came out sharper than intended, defensive, because the alternative was admitting I felt overwhelmed. Mark exhaled slowly. "Because you wouldn't have come if I told you it wasn't just me." He wasn't wrong. I would have ignored the message. I would have swallowed my loneliness for the sake of appearance, like always. He continued. We've watched you pretend everything is fine. We've watched you dim yourself down just to keep peace with someone who doesn't even notice. His words landed harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to deny it, to defend the person I'd been protecting out of habit, but Daniel spoke before I could. We've all seen it. The way he talks about you when you're not around. The way he brushes off anyone who tries to point it out. He looked uncomfortable saying it, like he didn't want to be the one to break whatever illusion I'd been clinging to. The third man, Josh, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You think you hide it well, but you don't. You're always holding your breath. Always shrinking into yourself whenever he's near. You deserve someone who actually sees you. Their words hit in waves. Embarrassment, anger, disbelief, and something painfully close to relief. I wasn't expecting honesty. I wasn't expecting intervention. I definitely wasn't expecting 3 men confronting the truth I'd been too afraid to say out loud. I didn't come here to talk about my marriage, I said quietly, though even I didn't believe it. Mark shook his head gently. You came because you're tired. And because you knew I wouldn't let you fall apart alone. My throat tightened. I should have been angry. I should have been offended, defensive, something. But all I felt was a strange mix of vulnerability and clarity. They weren't judging me. They weren't trying to lure me into anything. They were trying to stop me from breaking in silence. Just as I tried to gather myself enough to respond, Josh said something that made the room feel even smaller. He's not going to change. And you know it. For the first time that night, I didn't have the strength to pretend he was wrong. The words hung in the room like a weight I wasn't strong enough to lift. I stood there trying to blink away the sting in my eyes, but holding myself together felt like gripping glass. I didn't want to cry, not in front of them, not in front of anyone, but the truth they spoke had been sitting on my chest for months, maybe years, and now it finally had nowhere else to hide. I'm not here to be pitied, I managed, but my voice shook anyway. We know, Mark said softly. And we're not here to pity you. We're here because you keep carrying everything alone. That broke something in me. Not because of the words, but because of how sincerely he said them. Mark had always been observant, but this was different. This was him finally acknowledging the thing we had both avoided naming, that he cared. More than he should. More than I had allowed myself to understand fully until now that I sank into the nearest chair, unable to keep standing under the pressure of 3 people seeing me more clearly than the man I shared a home with. I covered my face for a moment, trying to breathe, trying to regain the calm I always forced myself to display. Daniel spoke next, quieter this time. You know, people only shrink that way when they're trying not to make someone angry, or trying not to be a burden, or trying not to disappoint someone who stopped noticing their efforts. His words were gentle, but they cut deep. As they were true. I looked at Mark then, really looked at him. He wasn't smug. He wasn't eager. He wasn't waiting for me to fall apart so he could step in. His expression was something else, something closer to concern, affection, and restrained honesty. Why did you call me upstairs? I asked him directly. Really? He hesitated for the first time all night. His jaw tightened slightly before he spoke. Because I knew you wouldn't ask for help. And I knew if I didn't say something soon, you'd keep hurting in silence. He paused, searching my face before adding quietly, and because I care about you more than I should. The room felt suddenly smaller. My heart dropped and lifted at the same time. It was the kind of confession that didn't need dramatics to be powerful. It was raw, unpolished. True that I didn't respond immediately. I couldn't. My thoughts ran in too many directions at once. Guilt, fear, longing, confusion, all tangled together. But underneath all of it was a quiet truth. I had felt something for him too. Something unspoken, something restrained, something that grew every time he noticed the things my husband ignored. Josh leaned back, letting the moment breathe. He's not trying to pull you away from anything, he said. He just didn't want to watch you drown pretending you're fine. I didn't realize I was crying until Mark moved closer. Not touching me, just close enough that I didn't feel alone. You're allowed to want more than survival, he said. That it wasn't a romantic declaration. It wasn't a selfish plea. It was a lifeline. For the first time in a long time, I let myself speak honestly. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know why I keep holding on when I'm the only one trying. Mark nodded, looking at me like he already understood. Because you've been taught to endure instead of ask for what you deserve. His voice softened further. But you don't have to endure alone. His words weren't a seduction. They weren't a promise. They were an anchor in a storm I had pretended wasn't happening. And in that moment, surrounded by 3 people who saw every fracture I tried to hide, I finally stopped protecting the illusion of a life that was breaking me. I didn't know what came next, I only knew that something had changed and there was no going back. When the silence finally settled, it felt different. Less like a pause and more like a turning point. I wiped my face, embarrassed by how exposed I felt, but none of them looked away. None of them acted uncomfortable. They simply waited, giving me space I hadn't realized I needed so desperately. I wasn't used to being listened to without interruption, without judgment, without someone twisting my words into accusations. It felt strange and unsettling, but also grounding. I don't even recognize myself anymore. I admitted quietly. I've spent so much time trying to keep everything together that I forgot what it feels like to be seen. Daniel nodded. That's what happens when someone stops valuing you. You start cutting pieces of yourself just to fit the version of you they still expect. I wanted to deny it, defend the man I had defended 100 times before. But the truth was no longer something I could hide behind excuses. The more I thought about it, the clearer everything became. Every ignored conversation, every eye roll, every time my needs were labeled as too much or bad timing or dramatic. I had made myself small so he could feel big. I had carried the relationship alone because he wouldn't lift even the smallest emotional weight. Josh leaned forward again, speaking with a calmness that made his words land harder. No one's telling you to leave him. No one's telling you to stay. We're telling you to stop pretending you're fine when you're not. And maybe that was the first real step, admitting that what I had been calling fine was actually a slow, quiet kind of decay. Mark finally sat beside me, not touching me, just close enough to feel like support. You deserve someone who chooses you even when it's inconvenient, he said. Someone who listens without acting like they're doing you a favor. I exhaled shakily. It's not that simple. I know, he replied. But staying miserable isn't simple either. For a moment, none of us spoke. The weight of years settled over me, years of excuses, years of walking on eggshells, years of convincing myself that love meant endurance rather than partnership. And now, faced with people who saw through every mask I'd worn, I couldn't keep pretending. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. I confessed. Mark shook his head. You don't need to decide tonight. You just need to stop convincing yourself that pain is normal. It was the first time in a long while someone gave me permission to slow down instead of pushing me to hold everything up. The pressure on my chest loosened just a little. I could finally breathe without feeling like I was stealing air. Daniel stood up first. We're downstairs if you need us. Josh followed. Their exit wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to overwhelm. They left because they sensed this part wasn't theirs to witness. When the door closed, Mark stayed quiet, giving me the dignity of choosing when to speak. I looked at him, not with confusion this time but with clarity. You meant it, didn't you? Everything you said. He nodded once. No rush. No expectation. Just truth. For the first time I didn't run from it. I care about you too, I admitted. Not as a confession of romance, not as a promise, but as an acknowledgement of a connection I could no longer silence. He didn't smile triumphantly or move closer. He simply looked relieved, like he had been carrying that truth carefully so it wouldn't fall on me too heavily. I don't know where this leads, I said. You don't need to, he replied. You just need to stop choosing pain out of habit. When I finally left the room, I wasn't lighter. Healing is an instant, but I wasn't numb either. I felt aware. Awake. Honest with myself for the first time in years. Downstairs, the noise of the gathering returned, but it no longer drowned me. This time I walked through it with a truth I couldn't unhear, a clarity I couldn't unsee, and a quiet promise to myself. I would no longer stay invisible in a life where I deserved to be seen.